On the afternoon of December 18th, 1996, in a hotel room at the Tysons Corner Marriott Hotel in Vienna, Virginia, a 43-year-old FBI special agent named Earl Edwin Pitts sat across from a man he believed to be a Russian intelligence officer. The room was unremarkable. Beige walls, standard hotel furniture, the faint smell of industrial carpet cleaner, heavy curtains drawn against the winter daylight. Pitts had arrived at approximately 2:15 p.m., parking his dark blue Ford Taurus in the lot and entering through a side entrance. He carried a black leather briefcase. The temperature outside was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light rain had been falling since morning. The man Pitts met with called himself Alexander. They had been in contact for several months, rekindling a relationship that had been dormant for years. During this meeting, Pitts handed over a package containing classified FBI documents, operational details about ongoing counterintelligence investigations, information about surveillance techniques, and data about FBI sources who were providing information about Russian intelligence activities in the United States. In exchange, he received an envelope containing $15,000 in cash. What Earl Pitts did not know was that Alexander was actually FBI Special Agent Mike Rochford, and that the hotel room was equipped with audio and video recording equipment. Every word of their conversation was being documented. Every gesture was being captured on film. And approximately 30 other FBI agents were positioned throughout the hotel and in the parking lot, ready to make an arrest once sufficient evidence had been gathered. Earl Edwin Pitts was not meeting with Russian intelligence. He was walking into a trap that had been carefully constructed over the previous 9 months by his own colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And when he left that hotel room and walked to his car at approximately 3:47 p.m., he would be arrested and charged with espionage, a crime he had been committing for more than 5 years, from 1987 to 1992, and which he had attempted to resume in 1995. The case of Earl Pitts would become one of the most damaging counterintelligence failures in FB1 history, not because of the volume of information he provided to the Soviet Union and later to Russia, but because of what his betrayal revealed about the vulnerability of the institutions designed to protect American national security. Pitts was not a clerk or a contractor with access to classified information. He was a trained counterintelligence specialist whose job was to catch Soviet spies. He knew the FBI's methods, its sources, and its weaknesses, and for 5 years he systematically exploited that knowledge to provide the Soviet KGB with information that compromised ongoing operations and endangered human lives. Before we examine how an FBI counterintelligence specialist became the very threat he was trained to detect, if you're interested in the documented cases of Cold War espionage and their lasting human consequences, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these carefully researched stories every week. Now, let's look at how Earl Pitts became one of the FBI's most damaging internal betrayals. Earl Edwin Pitts was born on September 23, 1953, in Urbana, Missouri, a small town with a population of approximately 400 people located in the southwestern part of the state. His father, Edwin Pitts, worked in construction and as a part-time farmer. His mother, Dorothy, was a homemaker who later worked as a clerk at a local grocery store. Earl was the second of 4 children. According to later interviews with family members and neighbors, the Pitts family was regarded as hard-working, religious, and unremarkable. They attended the local Baptist church regularly. The children were expected to contribute to household chores and to perform well in school. Earl was described by his teachers as an intelligent but quiet student who preferred reading to more social activities. He participated in Future Farmers of America and played trombone in the high school band. His grades were above average, particularly in mathematics and science. After graduating from Skyline High School in 1971, he enrolled at Central Missouri State University in Warrensburg, approximately 60 miles north of his hometown. At Central Missouri State, Pitts majored in biology with the intention of eventually attending medical school. He joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps program, which provided a partial scholarship. According to university records, he maintained a 3.4 grade point average and was regarded by professors as diligent and conscientious. In 1973, during his junior year, he met Mary Sue, a sophomore studying elementary education. They began dating in the fall of 1973 and were married in June 1975, immediately after both had graduated from the university. The decision to apply to the FBI came during Pitts's senior year. Court records indicate he had abandoned his plans for medical school, partly due to financial considerations and partly due to a growing interest in law enforcement. The FBI was actively recruiting college graduates during this period, particularly those with ROTC experience and strong academic records. Pitts submitted his application in early 1975 and was accepted into the FBI's training program that summer. FBI training in 1975 took place at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, a 385-acre facility that had been opened in 1972. The training program lasted approximately 16 weeks and covered firearms proficiency, defensive tactics, legal procedures, investigative techniques, and the specific methodologies of counterintelligence work. Training records show that Pitts performed adequately but not exceptionally, ranking in the middle of his class in most categories. Instructors noted that he was methodical and careful, following instructions precisely, and completing assignments thoroughly, though he was reluctant to take initiative and lacked the assertiveness that characterized more successful agents. Upon completion of his training in November 1975, Pitts was assigned to the FBI's field office in San Antonio, Texas. The San Antonio office was considered a relatively minor posting, primarily handling bank robberies, fugitive cases, and background investigations. Pitts and Mary Sue moved into a small apartment on the city's north side. Mary Sue found work as a substitute teacher. They lived modestly on Pitts's FBI salary, which in 1975 was approximately $13,000 per year. For the first 8 years of his FBI career, from 1975 to 1983, Earl Pitts worked routine cases in San Antonio. He investigated bank frauds, conducted background checks for security clearances, and assisted in fugitive apprehensions. His personnel evaluations during this period reflected his training assessments: competent, reliable, and detail-oriented, but lacking the drive for advancement. In 1977, Mary Sue gave birth to their first daughter. A second daughter was born in 1980. To protect their privacy, their names are not disclosed here. The family moved from their apartment to a small house in suburban San Antonio. Neighbors interviewed years later described the Pitts family as entirely ordinary, washing their car, working in the yard, loading the children into their station wagon for weekend outings. In 1983, Pitts applied for and was accepted into a specialized assignment in the FBI's counterintelligence division. The Cold War was at its height during this period, and the FBI was expanding its efforts to identify and neutralize Soviet intelligence operations within the United States. Pitts received additional training in counterintelligence methodology at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., then was assigned to the FBI's New York field office in early 1984. The New York field office was one of the FBI's largest and most important postings, with primary responsibility for monitoring Soviet intelligence activities centered around the United Nations and the Soviet diplomatic presence in New York City. Pitts was assigned to a squad focused on Soviet counterintelligence, specifically identifying and surveilling known or suspected KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover. The Pitts family relocated to the New York area in February 1984, settling in a three-bedroom house in a Long Island community approximately 30 miles east of Manhattan. The house, purchased for $142,000 with a mortgage, was significantly more expensive than their previous home in San Antonio, reflecting the higher cost of living in the New York metropolitan area. Mary Sue found substitute teaching work in the local school district. The daughters, then 7 and 4 years old, enrolled in the local elementary school. Testimony from colleagues and FBI investigative reports documented that Pitts's assignment to counterintelligence work in New York marked a significant change in his career trajectory. For the first time, he had access to highly classified information about FBI operations against Soviet intelligence. He learned the identities of FBI sources within the Soviet diplomatic and intelligence community. He was briefed on surveillance techniques, technical collection methods, and ongoing investigations. He attended regular meetings where counterintelligence cases were discussed in detail. The work was demanding. Counterintelligence operations often required surveillance shifts that lasted late into the night. Pitts would spend hours sitting in cars watching Soviet diplomatic facilities, photographing individuals entering and exiting, attempting to identify patterns that might indicate intelligence activities. He participated in operations to recruit Soviet diplomats as sources, though these efforts were largely unsuccessful. He reviewed classified cables and reports about Soviet intelligence activities around the world. But the assignment also brought significant financial strain. The cost of living in the New York area was substantially higher than what the family had experienced in San Antonio. The mortgage payment on their house consumed nearly 40% of Pitts's salary. Mary Sue's substitute teaching income was irregular and modest. The family owned one car and struggled to afford child care during Mary Sue's working days. Court documents revealed that Pitts and Mary Sue argued frequently about money. They fell behind on credit card payments. They borrowed money from Mary Sue's parents on at least 2 occasions to cover unexpected expenses. Credit card statements presented at trial showed mounting debt from approximately $3,000 when they arrived in New York to more than $18,000 by early 1987. In performance reviews from 1985 and 1986, supervisors noted that Pitts appeared distracted and that his work quality had declined. He was counseled about missed deadlines and incomplete reports. There were no disciplinary actions, but while other agents in his cohort were receiving promotions and being assigned to more significant cases, Pitts remained in his position without advancement. The recruitment of Earl Pitts by Soviet intelligence occurred in 1987. According to Pitts's later confession and court testimony, the approach was made by a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. The initial contact took place at a reception at the Soviet Mission Building on East 67th Street in Manhattan, an event that FBI counterintelligence agents, including Pitts, were attending as part of their official duties. The FBI regularly sent agents to such events to observe Soviet diplomats and to identify potential recruitment targets or to make recruitment approaches themselves. During the reception, Pitts later testified, a Soviet diplomat engaged him in conversation. The man was friendly and personable, expressing interest in Pitts's background and family. They discussed innocuous topics, Pitts's work in general terms, his time in Missouri, his family. The diplomat mentioned that he too came from a rural background and understood the challenges of adapting to life in a large city. They exchanged business cards. A week later, the diplomat called Pitts at the FBI office and suggested they meet for lunch to continue their conversation. FBI counterintelligence training explicitly warned agents about such approaches and required immediate reporting to supervisors of any contact with Soviet officials outside official settings. Earl Pitts did not report the contact. Instead, testimony reveals he met the Soviet diplomat for lunch at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan on July 15, 1987. During this lunch, the conversation gradually shifted toward more sensitive topics. The diplomat asked about Pitts's career satisfaction and his financial situation. Pitts acknowledged that he was experiencing financial difficulties and that he was frustrated with the lack of advancement in his career. According to Pitts's testimony, his handlers suggested that perhaps their two countries, despite being adversaries in the Cold War, had mutual interests in avoiding misunderstandings that could lead to dangerous escalations. Better communication between intelligence services might serve the interests of both nations. The proposition was framed not as treason, but as contribution to peace. In exchange, the Soviet government would provide financial assistance. The rationalization offered was classic Soviet recruitment methodology, framing espionage as contribution to stability rather than betrayal. Intelligence experts who later analyzed the case noted this approach was particularly effective with individuals experiencing personal or professional difficulties who could convince themselves that their actions were not fundamentally disloyal. Earl Pitts accepted the proposition. At a subsequent meeting in August 1987, court documents establish Pitts provided classified FBI documents to his Soviet handler. These initial documents included operational summaries of FBI counterintelligence cases targeting Soviet intelligence officers in New York. The documents identified specific Soviet diplomats who were under FBI surveillance and described the surveillance techniques being employed. In exchange, prosecutors later documented, Pitts received approximately $5,000 in cash. For the next 5 years, from August 1987 to June 1992, Earl Pitts systematically provided classified information to Soviet intelligence. Court records and FBI investigative reports document that the operational pattern was consistent. Pitts would gather documents or information during his regular work at the FBI's New York field office. These materials were copied or, in some cases, removed from secure facilities in violation of FBI security protocols. Pitts and his KGB handlers would meet approximately every 2 to 3 months at various locations in the New York metropolitan area, public parks, shopping mall parking lots, occasionally in rented cars. Pitts would provide documents or information, and his handler would provide cash payments. The total amount Pitts received over this 5-year period was $224,000, according to FBI accounting based on financial records presented at trial and Pitts's later cooperation. The payments were made in cash, in denominations of $50 and $100 bills. Pitts did not deposit this money in bank accounts, correctly understanding that large cash deposits would trigger reporting requirements and potentially attract attention. Instead, he kept the money hidden in his home and used it to supplement his family's income, paying for household expenses, reducing credit card debt, and funding small luxuries that would not seem inconsistent with his FBI salary. The damage assessment prepared by the FBI's Inspection Division and presented as evidence during his prosecution documented that the information Pitts provided to Soviet intelligence included detailed descriptions of FBI counterintelligence operations targeting Soviet intelligence officers in New York, the identities of KGB officers under surveillance, and the specific surveillance techniques being employed. He provided information about FBI sources within the Soviet diplomatic community, individuals who were providing information to the FBI either as recruited assets or as volunteers. He compromised technical details about FBI communications intercept capabilities, including the types of communications that could be monitored and the limitations of FBI technical collection methods. He handed over operational summaries of FBI investigations into suspected Soviet intelligence assets among American citizens, scientists, government employees, and academics who were believed to be providing information to Soviet intelligence. And he revealed information about FBI counterintelligence training methods, including how FBI agents were taught to identify and counter Soviet recruitment attempts. According to the damage assessment completed in 1997 and partially declassified in subsequent years, this information compromised numerous counterintelligence operations and potentially endangered the lives of FBI sources. Evidence presented at sentencing established the sudden cessation of productive contact with at least 3 Soviet diplomats who had been providing information to the FBI, suggesting they had been identified and recalled or disciplined. Investigators documented the observable modification of Soviet intelligence tradecraft in the New York area, indicating that Soviet intelligence officers had become aware of FBI surveillance methods and had adapted their procedures accordingly. The assessment concluded the probable compromise of technical collection operations as Soviet intelligence officers began using communications methods and meeting locations that avoided FBI monitoring capabilities. Most troubling was the likely identification of Soviet citizens who had been cooperating with American intelligence, though the specific identities and fates of these individuals could not be definitively determined. Throughout this period, from 1987 to 1992, Pitts continued to work counterintelligence cases, to write reports, to attend meetings, and to participate in surveillance operations. His performance evaluations during this period were mixed, but there were no indications that raised specific suspicions about espionage. His financial situation improved noticeably. The family paid off credit card debts, purchased a second car, took a vacation to Disney World, and made home improvements, but not so dramatically as to trigger concern. These expenditures were not inconsistent with what might be expected from careful financial management of an FBI agent's salary combined with his wife's income. Mary Sue later testified she remained unaware of her husband's espionage activities during this period. She was aware that their financial situation had improved and that Earl seemed less stressed about money, but she attributed this to better budgeting and to her own increased teaching income. In interviews conducted after Earl's arrest, she described their marriage during this period as stable but not particularly close. They focused on raising their daughters, maintaining their household, and managing their daily routines. Earl rarely spoke about his work, which Mary Sue attributed to the classified nature of his duties. In 1990, the Pitts family relocated from New York to the Washington, D.C. area. Pitts had been reassigned to FBI headquarters in Washington, where he was given a position in the Counterintelligence Division's analytical section. This was not a promotion, but rather a lateral transfer, typical for FBI agents at his level of seniority. The family sold their house on Long Island and purchased a larger home in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, approximately 50 miles south of Washington, D.C. The house, a four-bedroom colonial, was purchased for $198,000. Court testimony documented that Pitts established contact with a new KGB handler through procedures that had been set up during his time in New York. Court records indicate the new handler met with Pitts on several occasions in the Washington area between late 1990 and mid-1992. The meetings followed similar patterns: public locations, brief exchanges, documents for cash. The information Pitts provided after moving to Washington differed in focus. At FBI headquarters, he no longer had direct access to operational details about specific surveillance operations. Instead, his work in the analytical section gave him access to broader strategic information, assessments of overall Soviet intelligence capabilities and priorities, analyses of counterintelligence trends, and information about FBI resources and organizational structure. The damage assessment noted this strategic-level information was potentially even more valuable to Soviet intelligence, as it allowed Soviet intelligence planners to understand FBI capabilities and limitations at a systemic level. In December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The KGB was dissolved and reorganized into several successor agencies, including the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service, and the FSB, Federal Security Service. Many Soviet intelligence officers were recalled to Moscow. Funding for intelligence operations became erratic. Communications networks were disrupted. Established espionage networks, including the one that had been running Earl Pitts, were affected by this chaos. Pitts's later testimony indicated his last meeting with his Soviet handler during this initial period of espionage occurred in June 1992. The meeting took place in the parking lot of a shopping center in Fairfax, Virginia. His handler informed Pitts that their meetings would need to be suspended for an indefinite period due to organizational changes. He provided Pitts with a final payment of approximately $10, and instructions for how Pitts might reestablish contact in the future if circumstances changed. The instructions involved a specific mail drop procedure. Pitts was to send a postcard to a particular address in New York with an innocuous message that would signal his desire to resume contact. From June 1992 until October 1995, a period of more than 3 years, Earl Pitts did not engage in active espionage. He continued his work at FBI headquarters. His later accounts indicated he experienced considerable anxiety during this period, fearing that his previous espionage might be discovered, perhaps through a Soviet defector who might reveal his identity through surveillance he had not detected, or through inconsistencies in his financial records that might trigger investigation. But no investigation materialized during those 3 years. His espionage remained undetected. And, as time passed without consequences, court documents establish, Pitts began to consider the possibility of resuming his relationship with Russian intelligence. Both daughters were approaching college age. The mortgage payment on their Virginia house remained substantial. Mary Sue's teaching income was modest. The money he had received between 1987 and 1992 had been spent. In October 1995, court records show, Pitts sent a postcard to the address he had been given in 1992. The message was innocuous, something to the effect of enjoying the autumn weather and sending regards. 2 weeks later, Pitts received a telephone call at his office from someone who identified himself and suggested they meet for coffee. The meeting took place on November 3, 1995, at a coffee shop in Springfield, Virginia. The caller indicated that Russian intelligence was indeed interested in resuming contact and asked whether Pitts still had access to valuable information. Pitts confirmed that he did. They agreed to meet again in 3 weeks. The man calling himself Vladimir was FBI Special Agent Mike Rochford, and the entire approach had been an FBI sting operation. The investigation that led to Pitts's arrest had begun through information provided by a source with knowledge of KGB operations. In late 1995, declassified FBI documents indicate information reached American intelligence about the existence of a source within the FBI's New York field office who had been providing information to Soviet intelligence in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The source of this information did not know the agent's true identity, but was able to provide details about the type of information that had been provided, the approximate time period of the espionage, and the operational methods that had been used. This information was immediately referred to the FBI's counterintelligence division, which initiated an internal investigation to identify the source. The investigation, given the codename Gray Suit, focused on FBI personnel who had worked counterintelligence cases in New York during the relevant time period and who had access to the types of information that had been described. A list of approximately 30 potential suspects was developed. Earl Pitts was on this list, but he was not initially among the primary suspects. Other agents who had held more senior positions or who had access to more sensitive information were considered more likely candidates. However, as investigators examined financial records, personnel files, and operational access logs, certain patterns emerged that drew increased attention to Pitts. Financial analysis indicated that Pitts's spending patterns had changed noticeably between 1987 and 1992, with increased expenditures during the exact period when the espionage had been occurring. Personnel records indicated that Pitts had access to precisely the types of information described. Operational records showed that certain counterintelligence operations had been compromised during periods when Pitts had been briefed on them. By September 1995, court filings establish Pitts had been identified as the primary suspect, though the evidence was circumstantial and insufficient for prosecution. The decision was made to develop evidence through a false flag operation, an undercover approach in which FBI agents would pose as Russian intelligence officers and attempt to re-establish contact with Pitts to see if he would provide classified information to what he believed were his former handlers. The operation carried significant legal and operational risks, but if Pitts was guilty, it offered the possibility of obtaining direct evidence of his willingness to commit espionage, which would be far stronger than circumstantial evidence based on financial patterns and access logs. The false flag operation was approved by FBI leadership and by the Department of Justice in October 1995. The FBI would monitor the mail drop, hoping that Pitts might attempt to use it to re-establish contact. When Pitts's postcard arrived at the monitored address, the operation moved into its active phase. The undercover FBI agent who made contact with Pitts was Special Agent Mike Rochford, a veteran counterintelligence agent with extensive experience in espionage investigations. Rochford had been briefed extensively on the information about the operational methods used with the original FBI source, allowing him to convincingly pose as a Russian intelligence officer who was familiar with the previous relationship. During the meeting at the coffee shop on November 3, 1995, surveillance reports documented that Rochford established his credibility by demonstrating knowledge of details about Pitts's previous espionage relationship that only someone with access to Russian intelligence files would have known. He referred to approximate payment amounts, to the general types of information Pitts had provided, and to the circumstances under which contact had been suspended in 1992. This demonstration convinced Pitts that the contact was genuine. Rochford explained that Russian intelligence was reorganizing its operations in the United States following the disruptions of the early 1990s and was eager to reestablish contact with valuable sources. He asked Pitts what type of access he currently had to classified information. Pitts explained his current position at FBI headquarters and described the types of information he could potentially provide. Rochford expressed interest and suggested they establish a regular meeting schedule. They agreed to meet monthly, with Pitts providing classified documents in exchange for payment. Over the following 13 months, from November 1995 through December 1996, court records document that Earl Pitts met with undercover FBI agents posing as Russian intelligence officers on 9 occasions. These meetings took place at various locations in Virginia and Maryland: hotel rooms, parks, shopping center parking lots, and restaurants. During these meetings, Pitts provided classified documents, most of which he obtained by exploiting his authorized access to FBI computer systems and by copying materials from secure facilities. The information he provided included current FBI counterintelligence assessments, information about ongoing investigations, and technical details about FBI capabilities. All of these meetings were monitored by FBI surveillance teams. Many were recorded on audio or video equipment. The evidence being gathered was overwhelming. Pitts was clearly and deliberately providing classified information to individuals he believed to be hostile intelligence officers, and he was accepting money in exchange for this information. The investigation also examined Pitts's historical activities to gather evidence of his original espionage relationship with Soviet intelligence from 1987 to 1992. FBI forensic accountants traced the sources of cash deposits and expenditures during that period. Computer forensic specialists analyzed Pitts's work computer to identify files he had accessed during the late 1980s and early 1990s. While this historical evidence was more fragmentary than the current evidence being gathered through the false flag operation, it was sufficient to support charges related to the earlier period of espionage. By December 1996, the FBI had determined that sufficient evidence had been gathered to proceed with prosecution. The decision was made to make the arrest following one more meeting, which would be recorded with particularly high-quality audio and video equipment to ensure that the evidence would be clear and compelling at trial. The meeting on December 18, 1996, at the Tysons Corner Marriott Hotel, was designed to be the final evidence-gathering operation before arrest. FBI agents rented the hotel room weeks in advance and installed sophisticated recording equipment. The undercover agent, again Special Agent Rochford using the name Alexander, contacted Pitts to arrange the meeting, indicating that he had important matters to discuss and a substantial payment to deliver. Pitts arrived at the hotel at 2:15 p.m. as arranged. He parked his car and entered through a side entrance, proceeding to the designated room on the second floor. Rochford met him at the door. The audio transcript of the meeting documented that the two men exchanged greetings, and Pitts immediately began showing the classified documents he had brought. Printouts of FBI counterintelligence reports he had accessed and copied during the previous week. The conversation, which lasted approximately 90 minutes, covered various aspects of the information Pitts was providing, questions about FBI operations, and arrangements for future meetings. Throughout the conversation, the transcript revealed, Pitts demonstrated detailed knowledge of FBI counterintelligence methods and appeared entirely comfortable discussing how to exploit vulnerabilities in FBI security procedures. At approximately 3:30 p.m., court evidence showed the undercover agent provided Pitts with an envelope containing $15,000 in cash, money that had been carefully documented with photocopies of the serial numbers on the bills. Pitts counted the money, placed it in his briefcase along with the documents he had brought, and stood to leave. He and the undercover agent shook hands. Pitts said he would be in touch to arrange their next meeting in January. He left the hotel room at 3:47 p.m. Pitts walked down the hallway toward the elevator. The arrest report noted he appeared relaxed. He took the elevator to the first floor, crossed the lobby, and exited through the main entrance into the parking lot where his car was parked. As he approached his car through the light rain, the sound of his footsteps on wet pavement suddenly joined by others. Approximately 15 FBI agents moved in from multiple directions. The lead agent identified herself and ordered Pitts to stop and place his hands where they could be seen. The arrest report documented that Pitts appeared shocked, his face suddenly pale. He complied with the order, raising his hands. Agents quickly moved to secure him, placing him in handcuffs while reading him his rights. Pitts said nothing during the arrest. He was escorted to an FBI vehicle and driven to the Washington field office for processing and interrogation. His briefcase, containing the $15,000 he had just received and his personal items, was seized as evidence. His car was searched pursuant to warrant. At the FBI's Washington field office, Pitts was formally advised of his rights and was offered the opportunity to make a telephone call. He called Mary Sue. The agent monitoring the call reported that Pitts told his wife that he had been arrested and that he needed her to contact an attorney. Mary Sue sounded confused and asked what he had been arrested for. Pitts responded that she should call a lawyer and that he would explain later. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Over the following hours, FBI agents attempted to interview Pitts. He initially declined to answer questions without legal representation. However, later that evening, after consulting briefly with an attorney by telephone, court filings documented, Pitts indicated that he was willing to make a statement. He acknowledged that he had been providing classified information to the individuals he believed were Russian intelligence officers. He claimed initially that the information he had provided was not particularly sensitive and that he had not believed he was causing harm to American national security. He denied having engaged in espionage prior to 1995, claiming that his recent activities were his first involvement in such matters. This denial was contradicted by the evidence the FBI had already developed regarding his espionage activities from 1987 to 1992. When confronted with this evidence, financial records, access logs, and other documentation, Pitts initially attempted to maintain his denial. However, as the interview continued through the night and into the early hours of December 19th, interview summaries indicated Pitts gradually acknowledged that he had been involved in espionage during the earlier period as well. He became emotional at several points, stating that he had made mistakes and expressing concern about the impact on his family. By the morning of December 19th, Pitts had provided a preliminary statement acknowledging espionage activities from 1987 to 1992 and again from 1995 to 1996. He agreed to cooperate with investigators to provide a full accounting of his activities in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Over the following months, he participated in extensive debriefing sessions in which he provided detailed information about his recruitment, his meetings with handlers, the information he had provided, and the payments he had received. Earl Edwin Pitts was formally charged in federal district court with conspiracy to commit espionage and with communication of classified information to a foreign government. The charges covered both his activities from 1987 to 1992 and his resumed espionage from 1995 to 1996. The case, formally captioned United States vs. Earl Edwin Pitts, Criminal number 96-4 49-A, was assigned to Judge T.S. Ellis III of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, Alexandria Division, a venue that had become known for handling significant espionage cases due to its proximity to Washington and its experienced national security judges. The arrest received significant media attention. The case was unusual not only because Pitts was an FBI agent, but because his espionage had continued even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, suggesting motivation more clearly based on financial gain than on ideological commitment. News coverage emphasized the irony that a counterintelligence agent responsible for catching Soviet spies had himself become a Soviet spy. For Mary Sue Pitts and their daughters, then 19 and 16 years old, the arrest was devastating. Court filings and news reports confirmed that Mary Sue had no knowledge of Earl's espionage activities. She had believed her husband was a loyal FBI agent. The revelation that he had been betraying his country for money, and that the financial improvements the family had enjoyed during the late 1980s and early 1990s had come from espionage payments, was profoundly shocking. Friends and neighbors reported that Mary Sue became withdrawn and reclusive in the days following the arrest. The older daughter, then 19, and just beginning her first year at a community college, and the younger daughter, then 16 and in her junior year of high school, faced harassment and difficulties at school and in their community. Within weeks of Earl's arrest, Mary Sue filed for legal separation. She consulted with attorneys about her potential liability, whether she could be charged as an accessory or whether family assets could be seized as proceeds of espionage. Federal prosecutors determined that there was no evidence Mary Sue had been aware of or complicit in Earl's activities. However, the government did file civil forfeiture actions against certain family assets, arguing that property purchased with espionage proceeds should be surrendered to the government. The family home in Spotsylvania County became a particular focus of legal dispute. The government argued that a significant portion of the down payment and mortgage payments had come from espionage proceeds, and therefore the property was subject to forfeiture. Mary Sue's attorneys argued that she had contributed substantially to the mortgage payments through her teaching income and had no knowledge that any portion of the payments had come from illegal sources. Eventually, a settlement was reached in which Mary Sue was allowed to retain the house in exchange for surrendering other assets, including vehicles and bank accounts, that the government claimed were traceable to espionage payments. Earl Pitts's trial proceedings began in February 1997. Facing overwhelming evidence, including videotapes and audio tapes from the undercover meetings, testimony from the FBI agents who had conducted the false flag operation, financial records documenting unexplained cash expenditures during the late 1980s and early 1990s, and Pitts's own partial confession, his defense attorneys advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a negotiated sentence. Pitts agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of espionage, one count covering his activities from 1987 to 1992, and one count covering his resumed activities from 1995 to 1996. The plea agreement included provisions for Pitts to provide full cooperation with the FBI's damage assessment effort. Over several months in 1997, Pitts participated in extensive debriefing sessions in which he attempted to recall and describe every piece of information he had provided to Soviet and Russian intelligence. This cooperation was intended to help the FBI understand exactly what had been compromised and what counterintelligence operations might need to be terminated or restructured as a result of Pitts's espionage. The sentencing hearing took place in June 1997. Federal prosecutors argued for a severe sentence emphasizing the duration of Pitts's espionage, the sensitivity of the information he had provided, and the fact that he had resumed his espionage activities after a break. demonstrating that his betrayal was not a momentary lapse, but a sustained and deliberate course of criminal conduct. Prosecutors noted that Pitts had violated a position of extraordinary trust and had compromised operations designed to protect American national security. Defense attorneys argued for some degree of leniency based on his cooperation with investigators, his expression of remorse, and the impact that a lengthy sentence would have on his family. They emphasized that Pitts had not caused any known deaths of intelligence sources and that much of the information he provided was analytical rather than operational. They also noted that Pitts had been motivated primarily by financial concerns rather than by ideological hostility toward the United States. Judge T.S. Ellis rejected the defense's arguments for significant leniency. In his sentencing remarks, he emphasized that espionage was among the most serious offenses in federal law, that FBI agents held positions of extraordinary trust and responsibility, and that the compromise of counterintelligence operations could have life-or-death consequences even if those consequences were not immediately visible. He noted that Pitts's decision to resume espionage after the collapse of the Soviet Union demonstrated that his primary motivation was greed rather than any rationalization about contributing to peace or reducing Cold War tensions. On June 23, 1997, Earl Edwin Pitts was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison. Under federal sentencing guidelines in effect at that time, he would be required to serve approximately 85% of the sentence before becoming eligible for release, meaning he would serve at least 23 years. He was also ordered to forfeit all proceeds from his espionage activities and to cooperate fully with ongoing damage assessment efforts. Pitts was initially incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, a medium-security facility. He was placed in general population but was kept separate from other inmates who had worked in law enforcement. As former FBI agents face particular risks of violence in prison, the damage assessment conducted by the FBI in the year following Pitts's arrest, portions of which were later declassified, concluded that his espionage had caused significant harm to United States counterintelligence capabilities. Testimony presented during sentencing established the compromise of at least 7 FBI counterintelligence operations targeting Soviet intelligence officers in New York between 1987 and 1992. Resulting in the suspension or termination of these operations and the likely recall of Soviet intelligence officers who had been under FBI investigation. Evidence indicated the probable identification of Soviet or Russian citizens who had been cooperating with American intelligence, though the FBI could not definitively determine the fates of these individuals. The assessment documented the compromise of FBI surveillance techniques and methods, requiring modifications to operational procedures and potentially reducing the effectiveness of future counterintelligence operations. And it noted the erosion of trust within the FBI's counterintelligence division, as agents who had worked with Pitts had to consider the possibility that their operations had been compromised. In financial terms, the FBI estimated that Pitts's espionage had necessitated millions of dollars in expenditures to restructure compromised operations, enhance internal security measures, and rebuild intelligence relationships that had been damaged. For Mary Sue Pitts and her daughters, the years following Earl's conviction were marked by efforts to rebuild their lives under circumstances of considerable difficulty. Mary Sue divorced Earl in 1998, citing irreconcilable differences and the impossibility of maintaining a marriage with someone imprisoned for espionage. She continued working as a substitute teacher, though she eventually found full-time employment at a private school. The older daughter struggled academically and emotionally in the aftermath of the case. News accounts reported she withdrew from college after the spring 1997 semester and worked retail jobs for several years before eventually completing her degree at a different institution. The younger daughter faced harassment from classmates and struggled with depression. Accounts from school counselors indicated she had difficulty concentrating on schoolwork, and her grades declined significantly. Both daughters declined to visit their father in prison. Pitts's later accounts in interviews with prison officials indicated his daughters sent him letters occasionally during the first years of his imprisonment, but these communications were brief and formal, expressing little emotional connection. By the early 2000s, communication had effectively ceased. Mary Sue visited Earl in prison once, approximately 6 months after his sentencing, primarily to finalize details related to their divorce. News accounts noted the visit was brief. They did not meet again. The broader impact of the Pitts case on the FBI was significant. The case prompted a comprehensive review of internal security measures, particularly regarding the handling of classified information and the monitoring of employee access to sensitive materials. Prior to the Pitts case, FBI internal security procedures had focused primarily on preventing external threats rather than on detecting potential insider threats among FBI personnel themselves. Following Pitts's arrest and conviction, the FBI implemented several significant reforms: enhanced financial monitoring of employees with access to classified information, including periodic reviews of credit reports, large purchases, and lifestyle changes that might indicate unexplained income; more rigorous periodic security reviews, including regular polygraph examinations for employees in sensitive counterintelligence positions; improved audit trails for access to classified computer systems, making it easier to track which employees had accessed which documents and when; mandatory security training emphasizing the methods used by hostile intelligence services to recruit insiders and the warning signs of potential insider threats; and establishment of a dedicated insider threat program within the FBI's Security Division, responsible for proactively identifying and investigating potential security risks among FBI personnel. These reforms were modeled in part on security measures that the CIA had implemented following the Aldrich Ames case in 1994, which had revealed similar vulnerabilities regarding insider threats. The Pitts case demonstrated that the FBI, despite its expertise in counterintelligence operations against external threats, had been inadequately prepared to identify and counter threats from within its own ranks. In 2002, 5 years into his sentence, Earl Pitts was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, a lower security facility. The transfer was based on his good behavior while incarcerated and the absence of any disciplinary issues. At Cumberland, Pitts worked in the prison library and participated in educational programs. Prison records indicated he was regarded as a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, and generally keeping to himself. In 2016, after serving approximately 20 years of his 27-year sentence, including credit for good behavior, Earl Pitts was released from federal custody. He was 62 years old. News reports at the time indicated he was released to supervised parole and was required to report regularly to federal authorities. His relationship with his ex-wife and daughters remained essentially non-existent. Both daughters, by this time in their late 30s, had built lives that did not include their father. Mary Sue, who was in her mid-60s and had retired from teaching, declined requests from journalists to comment on Earl's release or on her feelings about the case after nearly 2 decades. The question of whether Earl Pitts's espionage had directly caused anyone's death remains unresolved. the FBI's damage assessment concluded that information he provided had likely led to the identification and recall of Soviet citizens who were cooperating with American intelligence, and that some of these individuals may have faced punishment upon their return to the Soviet Union. However, the specific identities of these individuals and their ultimate fates could not be determined with certainty. Soviet and Russian intelligence services did not share such information, and the chaos following the collapse of the Soviet Union made it difficult to trace what had happened to specific intelligence assets. What is certain is that Pitts's espionage compromised numerous counterintelligence operations and provided hostile intelligence services with detailed information about FBI capabilities and methods. This information would have allowed Soviet and later Russian intelligence services to modify their own operational methods to avoid detection and to identify potential vulnerabilities in FBI operations. The cumulative effect of this compromise was a degradation of American counterintelligence capabilities during a critical period of the Cold War and its aftermath. The question of responsibility in the case of Earl Edwin Pitts operates at multiple levels. At the most immediate level, Pitts made deliberate choices to commit espionage. He was not coerced. He was not manipulated or deceived about what he was doing. He understood that he was providing classified information to hostile intelligence officers. He knew his actions were illegal and that they violated his oath as an FBI agent. He chose to do it anyway, repeatedly, over many years. The responsibility for those choices is unambiguously his. But the case also raises questions about systemic factors that may have created conditions favorable to his recruitment. The financial pressures facing FBI agents assigned to high-cost areas like New York, where salaries adequate in other parts of the country were insufficient to maintain a middle-class lifestyle, created vulnerability. The relatively weak internal security measures that existed within the FBI prior to the Pitts case allowed him to access and copy classified information without detection for years. The professional frustrations that Pitts experienced, his sense of being undervalued, his lack of career advancement may have made him psychologically receptive to the validation offered by his Soviet handlers. And the Cold War intelligence environment itself created opportunities and incentives for both American and Soviet intelligence services to recruit sources. These systemic factors did not cause Pitts to commit espionage. Many other FBI agents faced similar pressures and did not betray their country. But these factors created conditions in which Pitts's personal vulnerabilities could be exploited, and in which his choices, once made, could continue undetected for years. The victims of Pitts's espionage extend well beyond the immediate operational compromises. There were the Soviet and Russian citizens who had been cooperating with American intelligence, whose identities and activities Pitts likely compromised, and who may have faced imprisonment or worse upon being identified. There were the FBI agents whose operations were undermined and whose trust in their colleague was betrayed. There were the intelligence analysts and policymakers who relied on information that had been compromised. And there were, most visibly and most painfully, Mary Sue and their 2 daughters, a wife and 2 daughters who had no role in Pitts's decisions and no knowledge of his crimes, but who bore profound consequences nonetheless. The case of Earl Edwin Pitts represents a type of espionage that became increasingly common in the post-Cold War period. Espionage motivated primarily by financial gain rather than ideological conviction. Unlike earlier generations of American spies, who often portrayed themselves as ideologically opposed to U.S. policies, Pitts appears to have had little genuine ideological commitment beyond his own financial comfort. This made his case in some ways more comprehensible. He was not a true believer, but simply a man who chose money over loyalty, but also perhaps more disturbing. as it suggested that critical national security positions could be betrayed for relatively modest sums and without even the rationalization of political principle. The damage Pitts caused was significant but not catastrophic. He was not in a position to provide the most sensitive intelligence available to the United States, as some other cases had done. His espionage was, in a sense, routine, one of many cases of individuals in trusted positions who chose to betray that trust for money, causing incremental but real harm to their country's national security interests. But routine cases still have profound human consequences. The Soviet and Russian citizens whose cooperation with American intelligence was compromised faced consequences that may have included imprisonment, professional destruction, and possibly death, though the specific fates of these individuals remain unknown. The FBI agents who worked with Pitts experienced the betrayal of a colleague and the knowledge that their operations had been compromised from within, and Mary Sue and her two daughters experienced the destruction of their family, the shame of public exposure, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives in the aftermath of someone else's choices. Earl Edwin Pitts was 34 years old when he first accepted money from Soviet intelligence in 1987. He was 43 when FBI agents, posing as his Russian handlers, recorded him selling secrets in a Virginia hotel room. He was 62 when he walked out of federal prison after 2 decades. The $224,000 he received over 5 years is long gone, seized, spent, vanished. The operations he compromised remain largely classified. The sources he may have endangered remain unnamed. But the family he destroyed remains visible in its absence. Daughters who built lives without him, a wife who rebuilt alone, grandchildren who will never know him. What was purchased with $224,000 and 20 years in prison was not ideology or principle or even substantial wealth. It was the temporary relief of financial pressure and the fleeting validation of being valued by his handlers. What was sold cannot be precisely quantified, some operations, some sources, some capabilities. What was lost is clearer. Everything he claimed to value outside the secrets he traded away. No dramatic photograph captured Earl Pitts in the moment of his betrayal as the image of Robert Chambers in Rock Creek Park had done decades earlier. But the evidence gathered by his own colleagues, videotapes and audio tapes recording him meeting with agents he believed were Russian intelligence officers, serves the same function. It is proof that betrayal can look entirely ordinary, that espionage can be committed by unremarkable people for unremarkable reasons, and that the gap between a trusted counterintelligence agent and a convicted spy can be as simple as choosing money over oath, comfort over duty, self-interest over every person who trusted you.